What's up? Thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to cover how to SSH to your Raspberry Pi 4 running RetroPie, and also while we're in there, we're going to overclock it to the max settings. Let's get started. Okay, so first things we need to get out of the way as far as prep. We need to make sure our Raspberry Pi is running RetroPie, the latest build, and we also need to go in and make sure that SSH is enabled on RetroPie. It is not by default. You're not going to be able to do all this with just a controller. You're going to need a keyboard as well. Okay, so let's enable SSH. Let's go to configuration. We're going to go over to Raspi Config. This is where we're going to need our keyboard. Let's go over to interface options. SSH. Do you want to enable SSH? Yes. So SSH is now enabled. Let's get back to the main menu. And now let's reboot our Raspberry Pi. All right, while that's rebooting, let's go ahead and download Putty. Putty is going to be our SSH client. SSH just means secure shell. And all that really means is connecting one computer to another. So let's go to putty.org. Download Putty. All right, now that our RetroPie is rebooted, let's go ahead and get its IP address. We're going to go to configuration and show IP. SSH needs an IP address to know which computer to connect to. All right, so my Ethernet connection is giving my Raspberry Pi a 192.168.1.25. We're just going to take note of that. All right, now let's move over to Putty on our Windows machine. Okay, so for hostname or IP address, we're going to use that IP that we wrote down from our RetroPie, that 192.168.1.25. Our port is always going to be 22. That is the dedicated SSH port for pretty much every machine on Earth. All right, and that's all we need for this. Let's go ahead and open our connection. Now it's prompting us for a username. That username by default is going to be just lowercase pi, and that's P-I, no E. And the password by default is going to be raspberry. All right, so now we have successfully accessed our RetroPie via SSH. It gives us this nice little status check to start us off. So first thing we want to do is become the root user. And what that means is we become the super admin of our RetroPie so that we can do everything without any questions asked. You do that by typing sudo su dash. Now we see that our $sign has turned into a hashtag or $. This means that we are now in root, and we have full power to do everything. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to type nano, which is a word processing application for Linux that also runs on RetroPie. Nano, and we're going to type our file path. We're going to start that off with a /. The file path, I believe, is boot, and another / followed by the file name, which is lowercase config.xml. Am I right? Nope, I'm wrong. Okay, so I was wrong. It's not an XML file, it's a text file. We're actually going to type nano space / boot / config.txt, not XML. And we should get something that looks just like this. All right, now we're in our config file. So let's scroll down by just clicking down on our keyboard until we get to this section. Uncomment to overclock the ARM processor. 700 megahertz is the default. We're going to be clocking this thing to 2147. Okay, so one precursor before we get started overclocking. You need some sort of CPU cooling. It doesn't have to be super fancy, but you need something to cool that processor because it's going to be running a lot hotter than the default settings. I have the Ice Tower cooler from Amazon. I'll link it in the description, but you're going to need some sort of cooling on that CPU because it's going to start getting hot. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and start our overclock settings. The first line that we want here is going to be over_voltage, make sure I spell that right, equals 6. Then we're going to go down by hitting enter, and we're going to go equals 2147. That's going to be our new clock speed going from 700. That's a big jump. GPU _freak equals 750. That's our GPU clock. All right, and we're all done. So to exit Nano, you just need to do Control X and then Y enter. And that's it. You've overclocked your Raspberry Pi. Now, you won't be able to use it in the overclocked settings right now. You'll need to reboot. And you can do that by just simply typing reboot. And we've been kicked from our connection. That means it's rebooting. While our RetroPie is rebooting, Overclocking is pretty much reserved for running higher end 3D stuff. It won't really show you a difference on the 2D stuff. You can always make sure the FPS counter is active, just so you can see what kind of frames you're getting now that you're overclocked. Alright, RetroPie has rebooted and no crashes or anything yet. That means our CPU is properly being cooled. One thing I've learned in the IT world is trust but verify. So let's go back over to our RetroPie and make sure that our clock settings are still there. And we are good to go. Looks like our clock settings have stayed. Now I have noticed with other builds like recall box builds, they actually have the overclock settings in the GUI, so you don't have to SSH to the Raspberry Pi to edit those, which is pretty convenient. But I always want to teach things like this because not only can you do cool stuff with your Raspberry Pi by knowing how to SSH to it, it's just a general computer skill I think everybody should know. But that's pretty much it. Peace.